When the trains pulled into places like Auschwitz, Dachau, or Buchenwald, people pressed against the wooden cattle car walls could smell something burning. They didn't know yet that it was human flesh. Within hours, many of them would understand. Within days, those who survived the initial selection would look so different that their own families wouldn't recognize them. This is the true story of how prisoners survived in Nazi Germany during World War II. It's about real people who endured unimaginable suffering and how they managed to stay alive when everything around them was designed to kill them. The journey. Most prisoners arrived after days crammed in cattle cars. There were no toilets, no water, no food. People stood pressed together so tightly they couldn't sit down. The elderly died standing up, held upright by the crowd. Mothers tried desperately to keep their children quiet because German guards shot through the walls at any noise. When the doors finally opened, SS guards with dogs screamed at people to move faster. Families were immediately separated. A German officer, often a doctor, pointed left or right with his thumb. Most people didn't realize this casual gesture was deciding who would live and who would die within hours. What happened to their appearance? The transformation began immediately. Guards forced new prisoners to strip naked in front of everyone. Men and women, old and young, stood exposed while SS officers and prisoner barbers shaved every hair from their bodies. They shaved heads, faces, underarms and pubic areas, leaving people looking eerily similar to each other. They tattooed numbers on forearms. Names no longer mattered. A man who had been called Abraham or Joseph was now simply A7713. A woman named Sarah or Anna became a number scratched into her skin with ink. They threw striped uniforms at prisoners that never fit properly. The fabric was coarse and thin, offering no warmth in winter and absorbing every drop of sweat in summer. Wooden clogs replaced shoes, causing constant blisters and infections. The physical appearance of new prisoners. People who arrived healthy looked gaunt within 2 weeks. Their eyes became hollow, cheekbones protruded sharply. The skin stretched tight over skulls, making everyone look like living skeletons. Without hair, without their own clothes, without even their names, prisoners began to look less like individuals and more like copies of each other. One survivor remembered looking in a mirror after 3 weeks and not recognizing himself. His face had become a skull with skin stretched over it. His eyes had sunk so deep they looked like dark holes. He was 28 years old, but looked 70. What they were given. Every morning at 4 a.m. a bell clanged. Prisoners received what the Germans called coffee, but was actually brown water, sometimes made from acorns or burnt bread. It was hot, and that was its only value. At midday, they got soup. This soup was mostly water, with a few pieces of rotten turnip or potato floating in it. Sometimes there were worms in the vegetables. Sometimes, if prisoners were very lucky, there was a tiny piece of horse meat. The soup was always thin, always tasteless, and never enough. In the evening, each prisoner received a small piece of black bread. It was made with sawdust, mixed into the flour to make it go further. The bread was 300 grams, roughly the size of a fist. This came with a tiny smear of margarine or a sliver of sausage that was mostly sawdust and chemicals. The total food amounted to maybe 1,300 calories a day. Meanwhile, prisoners worked 12-hour shifts doing back-breaking labor that required at least 3,000 calories to sustain life. How hunger changed their bodies. Within a month, prisoners lost massive amounts of weight. Their bodies consumed their own fat first, then their muscles. Their legs became stick-thin, but their stomachs swelled from malnutrition. This combination made them look pregnant, even though they were starving. Their teeth became loose and fell out from scurvy. Their gums bled constantly. Their skin turned grey-yellow and became so thin that bruises appeared from the slightest touch. Bones pressed against skin everywhere, creating sharp angles at elbows, knees, and hips. Hair stopped growing. Fingernails became brittle and broke off. Wounds didn't heal because bodies had no nutrition to repair themselves. Even small cuts became infected and oozed pus. People's faces changed the most dramatically. Eyes became huge and shrunken faces. Lips pulled back from teeth, creating death's head grins. Ears seemed too large because cheeks had disappeared. Every skull bone became visible through the skin. The obsession with food hunger consumed every thought. Prisoners dreamed about food every night and woke up with saliva in their mouths. They talked constantly about meals they remembered from before the war. They described their mother's cooking in minute detail, remembering every ingredient, every taste, every smell. One survivor remembered a man who spent every evening describing the perfect apple strudel. He would close his eyes and explain how the pastry was made, how the apples were sliced, how the cinnamon smelled. He did this every single night for months. Then one morning, he didn't wake up. He had died in his sleep, probably dreaming of strudel. How they got extra food. Prisoners developed what they called organizing, which meant stealing, trading, or begging for extra food. This required enormous risk, because getting caught meant death. But the hunger was so intense that people took the risk anyway. Some prisoners worked in camp warehouses where new arrivals' belongings were sorted. These prisoners might steal a piece of bread from someone's suitcase and hide it in their clothes. They could trade this bread for other things or eat it themselves. Others cultivated relationships with certain guards or prisoner functionaries who had access to better food. A prisoner who worked as a mechanic might fix something for a guard and receive an extra potato. A prisoner who spoke German might translate something and get a piece of cheese. The most desperate ate things that weren't really food. They ate grass, which caused terrible stomach pain. They ate leaves, which provided no nutrition. They scraped mold off walls and ate it. They fought over potato peels in garbage bins. Some caught and ate insects, mice, or rats when they could. The labor, every day except Sunday. Prisoners worked from dawn until dark. The work was designed to be pointless and exhausting. Guards wanted prisoners to work hard enough to be useful, but not so well fed that they could stay healthy. In quarries, prisoners carried heavy stones up steep stairs for 12 hours. The stones weighed as much as the prisoners themselves. Men who weighed 90 pounds carried 80-pound stones. When they stumbled, guards beat them. When they fell, guards sometimes shot them or pushed them off cliffs. In construction details, prisoners mixed cement with their bare hands until the chemicals ate through their skin. They carried lumber that cut into their shoulders until bones were visible through torn flesh. They dug ditches in frozen ground with tools that broke their blistered hands. In factories, prisoners manufactured weapons and ammunition for Germany. They operated dangerous machinery without safety equipment. They breathed toxic fumes without masks. They worked with chemicals that burned their lungs and skin. What labor did to their appearance. Heavy labor on starvation rations created bodies that looked barely human. Muscles wasted away completely, leaving only bones and skin. Spines curved from carrying heavy loads. Legs bowed outward from malnutrition and weight-bearing. Hands became deformed claws. Fingers broke and healed crooked. Fingernails fell off and didn't grow back. Feet swelled grotesquely from standing all day in wooden clogs. Toes turned black from frostbite in winter and infections in summer. Prisoners developed open sores that never healed. Skin split at joints from movement. Backs became raw from beatings and carrying loads. These wounds attracted flies that laid eggs in the flesh, causing maggot infestations that prisoners couldn't treat. By the end of 3 months of hard labor, a healthy man who had arrived weighing 160 pounds might weigh 80 pounds. His body looked like a skeleton wrapped in loose skin. Every bone was visible. His face was a skull. His hands looked like bird claws. His legs were thin sticks that could barely support his weight. The toll on human movement. Starved, beaten, and worked to exhaustion, prisoners moved differently than healthy people. They shuffled rather than walked because they lacked energy for normal strides. They couldn't lift their feet properly, so they scraped along the ground. They stooped forward because they lacked muscle strength to stand upright. Their heads hung down because neck muscles were too weak to hold them up. Their arms dangled limply at their sides. When guards ordered them to run, they could only manage a kind of stumbling trot. When they had to carry things, their whole bodies trembled from the effort. When they stood at attention for hours during roll call, they swayed and sometimes collapsed. What prisoners really looked like photographs from liberated camps show the truth, but even these can't fully capture what prisoners looked like in person. Their appearance went beyond simple thinness into something that didn't seem quite human anymore. Eyes were the most disturbing feature. They sunk so deep into skulls that they sat in dark holes. The eyeballs themselves often had a glassy, unfocused look, as if the person was seeing something far away or had retreated deep inside themselves. Some prisoners had what survivors called the camp stare, eyes that looked at you but didn't see you, that had witnessed so much horror they couldn't process normal reality anymore. Skin took on colors never seen on healthy humans. It wasn't just pale, but had a strange grey-green or yellow-grey tinge. It looked translucent, almost like wax paper, so thin that veins showed through everywhere. On arms and legs, every tendon and ligament was visible under the skin like strings on a puppet. Faces became terrifying masks. With no fat under the skin, every skull bone pressed outward. Foreheads were all bone. Eye sockets were deep caves. Cheekbones jutted out so far they created sharp angles. Jawbones were completely visible and looked too large for the shrunken faces. Temples were hollow indentations on either side of the head. Mouths changed shape as teeth loosened and lips shrank. Many prisoners' mouths hung slightly open because they lacked the energy to keep them closed. Lips cracked and bled, creating red streaks down their chins. Teeth, when visible, were brown or black from decay and bleeding gums. The smell. The appearance was terrible, but the smell was equally horrifying. Prisoners smelled of death even while still alive. It was a combination of unwashed bodies, infected wounds, dysentery, gangrene, and something else. The smell of starvation itself, a sickly sweet odor that came from bodies consuming themselves. They smelled of urine and feces, because many had dysentery and couldn't control their bowels. They smelled of pus from infected wounds. They smelled of rotting teeth and gum disease. All of this mixed together created a stench so overpowering that guards kept distance from prisoners. American and British soldiers who liberated the camps remembered the smell hitting them hundreds of yards before they reached the gates. One soldier said it was the smell of death, but somehow worse because these people were still alive. I've never smelled anything like it since, and I hope I never do. Men and women. Male prisoners lost all muscle definition. Bodies that had been strong became weak and shapeless. Shoulders that had been broad became narrow. Chests that had been full became concave, with ribs sticking out like xylophone keys. Hips became wider than shoulders as muscles wasted. Female prisoners suffered additional horrors. Breasts disappeared completely as bodies consumed all fat. Menstruation stopped within weeks of arrival because bodies had no extra resources for reproduction. This was actually a relief for most women, because dealing with periods without any hygiene products was nightmarish. Women's faces took on the same skeletal appearance as men's faces, but this seemed even more shocking to those who saw them, because women's faces are usually rounder than men's faces. Female prisoners looked like ancient crones, even if they were only 20 years old. Pregnant women who arrived at camps faced immediate selection for death. If they somehow hid their pregnancies and gave birth in the camps, the babies were usually killed immediately. A few children were born and somehow survived, though they bore the marks of starvation from the womb. Child prisoners were perhaps the most heartbreaking sight of all. Children's bodies couldn't handle starvation the way adult bodies could. They needed nutrition for growth, so when deprived of food, their development simply stopped. Children in camps had heads that seemed too large for their stick-thin bodies. Their stomachs swelled dramatically from malnutrition. Their arms and legs were like twigs that seemed they would snap at any moment. Their faces had the hollow-eyed, skeletal look of the adults, but seemed even more wrong, because children's faces should be round and full. Children stopped playing. They stopped laughing. They moved slowly and carefully like very old people. Some children simply sat motionless for hours, too weak and too traumatized to move. They aged decades in months, looking like elderly people trapped in small bodies. The living dead prisoners had a term for people who had given up the will to live. They called them muselmänner, though the origin of this term is unclear and likely offensive. These were people who had reached the absolute limit of human endurance and simply stopped trying to survive. You could recognize a Muselmann by looking at them. Their eyes were completely empty, not just hollow, but vacant. They didn't blink normally. They stared at nothing and didn't react when spoken to. They moved mechanically, like broken machines, putting one foot in front of the other, but with no purpose behind it. Their faces had no expression at all. Most prisoners, even in terrible condition, showed some emotion: fear, anger, sadness, determination. Muselmänner showed nothing. Their faces were masks, completely blank. Their mouths hung open. Sometimes saliva dripped from their lips and they didn't notice. They stopped eating. Guards would give them their bread ration, and they would hold it in their hands but not raise it to their mouths. Other prisoners could take food from their hands, and they wouldn't resist. They had stopped caring whether they lived or died. They stopped trying to avoid danger. During work, they would walk slowly while guards screamed at them, and they didn't flinch when beaten. They would stand in the path of falling objects and not move. They would urinate or defecate where they stood, because they had stopped caring about anything. Everyone knew that once someone became a Muselmann, they would be dead within days. Sometimes they simply lay down and died. Sometimes they walked into the electrified fence. Sometimes guards shot them for being too slow at work. Muselmänner were people who had already died inside, and their bodies were just catching up. Why this matters for survival. The Musulman showed something important. Surviving the camps wasn't just physical. People had to maintain some will to live, some reason to keep going. Those who lost this will died, even if their bodies could have survived longer. Survivors say that everyone in the camps stood at the edge of becoming a Muslim. The hunger, the pain, the hopelessness pushed everyone toward that edge. The difference between those who survived and those who became Muslimana was often very small. A letter from home, a kindness from another prisoner, a memory that gave meaning, a stubborn refusal to give the Nazis the satisfaction of victory. Maintaining humanity. Despite looking barely human on the outside, some prisoners fought desperately to maintain their humanity on the inside. They did this in small ways that required enormous courage. Some prisoners shared their already inadequate food with others who were worse off. This seems impossible. How could someone who was starving give away food? But some did. They would give half their bread to a friend who was sick, knowing this might kill them both, but unable to watch the other person die. Others maintained cleanliness as much as possible. They would use precious drops of water to wash their faces. They would try to keep their uniforms as clean as possible. They would comb their fingers through their hair, even though they had no hair. These small acts of grooming helped them remember they were human beings, not animals. Groups of prisoners recited poetry to each other at night, whispered quietly so guards wouldn't hear. They told stories about their lives before the war. They described their families, their homes, their hopes for the future. This helped them remember who they had been and who they might be again. Some prisoners prayed, even though God seemed absent from these places. They formed secret religious services, risking death to observe their faiths. Jewish prisoners secretly observed Sabbath. Catholic prisoners secretly held communion. This spiritual resistance helped them maintain identity and hope. Acts of defiance. Some prisoners found ways to sabotage the German war effort. Workers in ammunition factories made subtle changes that would cause bullets to misfire or shells to explode prematurely. Workers in other factories worked slowly without appearing to do so, reducing production without getting caught. Prisoners stole documents and smuggled them to resistance movements outside the camps. They tried to get messages out about what was happening, hoping the world would intervene. They hid people during selections, concealing sick prisoners so they wouldn't be killed. These acts of resistance rarely changed the outcome significantly, but they mattered psychologically. They let prisoners feel they were still human beings with agency, not just victims being led to slaughter. This psychological difference sometimes meant the difference between maintaining the will to live and becoming a Muslim. Prisoners with skills. Prisoners who had useful skills sometimes had slightly better chances of survival. A doctor, even a Jewish doctor, might be kept alive to treat other prisoners. A mechanic might be kept alive to repair machines. An electrician, a plumber, a carpenter, all might receive marginally better treatment because they were useful. But this came at a terrible cost. Doctor prisoners were often forced to participate in Nazi medical experiments or to make decisions about who would live and who would die. They had to choose which prisoners were healthy enough to be useful and which should be sent to the gas chambers. Living with these choices haunted survivors for the rest of their lives. Musicians were sometimes kept alive to play in camp orchestras. These orchestras played cheerful music while prisoners marched to work, and while new arrivals were led to gas chambers. The juxtaposition of classical music and mass murder was deeply disturbing, but musicians played because refusing meant death. Prisoners of war. The treatment of prisoners of war varied enormously depending on which army they came from. British and American POWs were generally treated according to Geneva Convention rules. They received food packages from the Red Cross, could send and receive mail, and were not systematically murdered. Their conditions were still terrible. They were hungry. They were worked hard. They were mistreated. But they had hope that their countries were fighting for their freedom. Soviet POWs, by contrast, were treated almost as badly as Jewish prisoners. Nazi ideology considered Slavic peoples as subhuman, and Stalin's USSR hadn't signed the Geneva Conventions. Of approximately 5.7 million Soviet POWs captured by Germany, about 3.3 million died. That's a death rate of nearly 60%. Soviet POWs arrived looking like healthy soldiers. Within months, they looked exactly like concentration camp prisoners, skeletal, hollow-eyed, bent and broken. They received almost no food, no medical care, and were worked to death in the same brutal conditions as other prisoners. Their bodies piled up in the same mass graves. The death marches. As Allied forces approached in 1944 and 1945, Nazis tried to hide evidence of their crimes. They evacuated camps and forced prisoners on long marches through winter weather. These became known as death marches because so many prisoners died during them. Prisoners who had barely survived until that point were suddenly forced to march dozens of miles without food, water, or rest. They wore the same thin uniforms in freezing winter weather. They walked through snow and ice in wooden clogs that fell apart. When prisoners fell from exhaustion, guards shot them and left their bodies by the roadside. Survivors of these marches describe walking among the dead. Every few yards, another body lay in the snow. The roads from camps to other locations were lined with corpses. Prisoners stepped over the bodies of people who'd been walking next to them hours before. They kept moving because stopping meant joining the bodies in the snow. One survivor described feeling his body shutting down during the march. His legs moved automatically, but he couldn't feel them anymore. His mind began wandering, and he found himself forgetting where he was. The only thing that kept him going was the determination that if he was going to die, it wouldn't be by giving up. Then, after 3 days, the marching stopped. The guards had fled. American soldiers appeared. What liberators saw. When Allied soldiers first reached the camps, nothing could have prepared them for what they found. Hardened combat veterans who had fought through some of the war's bloodiest battles broke down crying at what they saw. They found thousands of living people who looked like corpses. These prisoners were so thin that soldiers couldn't believe they were alive. They moved slowly or not at all. Many couldn't walk. They had sores covering their bodies. They stank of death and disease. Their eyes were huge in their skeletal faces, staring at their liberators with expressions soldiers couldn't interpret. Hope, disbelief, fear, nothing at all. Piles of corpses lay everywhere, bodies stacked like firewood, bodies in ditches, bodies in barracks where prisoners had been too weak to remove them. Many of these corpses were so emaciated that they barely looked human, just bones held together by a thin layer of skin. One American general, Dwight Eisenhower, insisted on touring a liberated camp. He wanted to see the evidence with his own eyes, so he could testify that it was real. After his visit, he ordered nearby German civilians to tour the camp and witness what had been done. He said that the world needed to see this so that no one could ever deny it happened. The survivors' appearance at liberation photographs taken at liberation show the truth. Prisoners weighed 70 or 80 pounds when they should have weighed 150 or 160. Their skin hung in folds because it had stretched over fat and muscle that was now gone. They looked like they were wearing skin that belonged to larger people. Their eyes dominated their faces because everything else had shrunk. They had no teeth or damaged teeth. Their hair, if it had grown back at all, was thin and patchy. They had open wounds and infections covering their bodies. Many could not stand without support. British soldiers who liberated Bergen-Belsen found 60,000 prisoners. About 13,000 of them died after liberation, despite medical care, because their bodies were too damaged to recover. Soldiers tried to feed them, but many died because their stomachs couldn't handle normal food after months or years of starvation. Medical personnel had to be careful when feeding survivors. Too much food too quickly would kill them. Their bodies had adapted to starvation, and sudden refeeding caused fatal complications. So doctors gave them tiny amounts of bland food and gradually increased portions over weeks. The psychological state liberation didn't bring immediate joy for many prisoners. Some couldn't comprehend they were free. They had been told so many times they would never leave the camps alive that they couldn't believe they were leaving alive. Some worried it was a trick, that the Nazis would return. Others felt overwhelming grief when they realized they were free, but their families were dead. They had survived, but everyone they loved had been murdered. What was the point of survival if they were alone? Many survivors couldn't cry. They had seen so much death that they felt numb to it. Soldiers reported trying to comfort prisoners who stood silently, unable to show any emotion. The trauma was so deep that normal human responses had shut down. Some survivors became frantic trying to find family members. They searched desperately through camps, looking at face after face, hoping to recognize someone. Usually they found no one. The faces all looked the same anyway, skeletal, hollow-eyed, barely human. Physical recovery survivors spent months or years recovering physically. Their bodies slowly rebuilt as they received adequate nutrition. They gained weight, though many never returned to their pre-war weight. Their skin color improved. Their eyes became less hollow. Their hair grew back, but the damage was permanent in many ways. Survivors had chronic health problems for the rest of their lives. They had digestive issues from years of starvation. They had respiratory problems from breathing toxic fumes and suffering from diseases like tuberculosis. They had bone problems from malnutrition and beatings. They had neurological damage from trauma and malnutrition. Many survivors looked older than their years for the rest of their lives. A woman who was 25 at liberation might look 50 by age 40. A man who was 30 might look 60 by his 50s. The suffering had aged them in ways that couldn't be reversed. Psychological scars. The psychological damage was even more profound than the physical damage. Survivors suffered from what we now call post-traumatic stress disorder, though that term didn't exist yet. They had nightmares every night about the camps. They woke up screaming, thinking they were back there. They couldn't sleep in the dark because darkness reminded them of the camps. They couldn't stand the sound of dogs barking because dogs had attacked them in the camps. They couldn't stand certain smells that reminded them of death. Many survivors felt intense guilt. They wondered why they survived when better people died. They felt they didn't deserve to live when their families had died. Some survivors lived with this guilt for decades, never forgiving themselves for surviving. Trust was almost impossible for many survivors. They had seen humanity at its worst. They had watched people betray each other for a piece of bread. They had seen people walk past others dying and do nothing. How could they trust anyone again? Some survivors became obsessed with food. Even decades later, they hoarded food in their homes, unable to throw anything away. They couldn't stand to see food wasted. They ate everything on their plates and their children's plates, even when full, because the memory of hunger never left them. Why appearance matters. Understanding what prisoners look like matters for several reasons. First, it makes the suffering real in a way that statistics cannot. Saying 6 million Jews died is important, but seeing photographs of what those people looked like before they died, seeing how their bodies were transformed by deliberate cruelty, makes the horror visceral and undeniable. Second, it shows the deliberate nature of Nazi cruelty. Prisoners didn't just happen to become skeletal. Nazi policy deliberately starved them while working them to death. The transformation from healthy human to living skeleton was planned and systematic. Third, it honors the victims by acknowledging the full extent of what they endured. They didn't just die. They suffered hideously first. They were systematically dehumanized in appearance as well as treatment. Acknowledging this suffering is part of remembering them properly. The human capacity for both evil and endurance. The Holocaust shows two opposite truths about humanity. It shows that humans can create and participate in unimaginable evil. Ordinary people became guards who murdered children. Doctors performed fatal experiments. Engineers designed gas chambers. Bureaucrats organized genocide with paperwork and efficiency. But it also shows that humans can endure almost anything. People who should have died kept living. They found reasons to survive one more day, then another, then another. They maintained their humanity despite every effort to strip it away. They helped each other even when helping meant risking their own lives. Both lessons matter. We need to remember that evil is possible so we can guard against it. We need to remember that endurance is possible so we can find hope in dark times. For those who survive, the survivors of the Holocaust carried their experiences for the rest of their lives. Many couldn't speak about what happened for decades. When they finally did, they said they needed to bear witness, to tell the world what happened so it would never happen again. They said they survived not just for themselves, but for those who died. They felt obligated to live full lives because millions couldn't. They felt obligated to have children because millions of children had been murdered. They felt obligated to tell their stories because millions couldn't tell theirs. One survivor said, "I wake up every morning and I remember. I remember my mother, my father, my sisters. I remember the camp. I remember the faces of people who died. And I live today for all of them. Every day I live is a victory over Hitler. Every day I live, I am defying the people who wanted me dead. So I live fully, because I am living for millions who cannot." Why appearance matters. Understanding what prisoners looked like matters for several reasons. First, it makes the suffering real in a way that statistics cannot. Saying 6 million Jews died is important, but seeing photographs of what those people looked like before they died, seeing how their bodies were transformed by deliberate cruelty, makes the horror visceral and undeniable. Second, It shows the deliberate nature of Nazi cruelty. Prisoners didn't just happen to become skeletal. Nazi policy deliberately starved them while working them to death. The transformation from healthy human to living skeleton was planned and systematic. Third, it honors the victims by acknowledging the full extent of what they endured. They didn't just die, they suffered hideously first. They were systematically dehumanized in appearance as well as treatment. Acknowledging this suffering is part of remembering them properly. The human capacity for both evil and endurance. The Holocaust shows two opposite truths about humanity. It shows that humans can create and participate in unimaginable evil. Ordinary people became guards who murdered children. Doctors performed fatal experiments. Engineers designed gas chambers. Bureaucrats organized genocide with paperwork and efficiency. But it also shows that humans can endure almost anything. People who should have died kept living. They found reasons to survive one more day, then another, then another. They maintained their humanity despite every effort to strip it away. They helped each other even when helping meant risking their own lives. Both lessons matter. We need to remember that evil is possible so we can guard against it. We need to remember that endurance is possible so we can find hope in dark times. For those who survive. The survivors of the Holocaust carried their experiences for the rest of their lives. Many couldn't speak about what happened for decades. When they finally did, they said they needed to bear witness, to tell the world what happened so it would never happen again. They said they survived not just for themselves, but for those who died. They felt obligated to live full lives because millions couldn't. They felt obligated to have children because millions of children had been murdered. They felt obligated to tell their stories because millions couldn't tell theirs. One survivor said, "I wake up every morning and I remember. I remember my mother, my father, my sisters. I remember the camp. I remember the faces of people who died. And I live today for all of them. Every day I live is a victory over Hitler. Every day I live, I am defying the people who wanted me dead. So I live fully because I am living for millions who cannot."